Okay, we're just gonna hop right into it with Chapter 7, where we left off. Yet all this was only the prologue of the actual Dunwich horror. Formalities were gone through by bewildered officials, abnormal details were duly kept from press and public, and men were sent to Dunwich and Aylesbury to look up property and notify any who might be heirs of the late Wilbur Whatley. They found the countryside in great agitation, both because of the growing rumblings beneath the domed hills, and because of the unwonted stench and the surging, lapping sounds which came increasingly from the great empty shell formed by Whatley's boarded-up farmhouse. Earl Sawyer, who tended the horse and cattle during Wilbur's absence, had developed a woefully acute case of nerves. The officials devised excuses not to enter the noisome boarded place, and were glad to confine their survey of the deceased's living quarters, the newly mended sheds, to a single visit. They filed a ponderous report at the courthouse in Aylesbury, and litigations concerning heirship are said to still be in process amongst the innumerable Whatlys, decayed and undecayed, of the upper Miskatonic Valley. An almost indeterminable manuscript in strange characters, written in a huge ledger and adjudged a sort of diary because of the spacing and variations in ink and penmanship, presented a baffling puzzle to those who found it on the old bureau which served as its owner's desk. After a week of debate, it was sent to the Miskatonic University, together with the deceased's collection of strange books, for study and possible translation, but even the best linguists soon saw that it was not likely to be unriddled with ease. No trace of the ancient gold with which Wilbur and old Whatley always paid their debts has yet been discovered. It was in the darkest September 9th that the horror broke loose. The hill noises had been very pronounced during the evening, and dogs barked frantically all night. Early risers on the 10th noticed a peculiar stench in the air, and about 7 o'clock Luther Brown, the hired boy at George Corey's, between Cold Spring Glen and the village, rushed frenziedly back from his morning trip to 10-Acre Meadow with the cows. He was almost convulsed with fright as he stumbled into the kitchen, and in the yard outside the no less frightened herd were pawing and lowing pitifully, having followed the boy back in the panic they shared with him. Between gasps, Luther tried to stammer out his tale to Miss Corey. "I'm there in the rut beyond the glen, Miss Corey. There's something been there. Smells like thunder, and all the bushes and little trees have been pushed back from the rut as the house moved along. And that ain't the worst neither. There's a prince in the rut, Miss Corey. Running around, Prince Billy bare heads all sunk down deep like elephants been along. Only there's a sight more than 3 or 4 feet to make. I looked at 1 or 2 before I run, and I see everyone's covered with lines spreading out from one place to a big palm leaf fence. 3 times any bigger days had been pounded down on the rug, and the spell was awful, like what's around over the old Wizard Waddler's house." And here he faltered, and seemed to shiver afresh with the fright that had sent him flying home. Miss Corey was unable to extract more information, and began telephoning the neighbors, thus starting on its rounds the overture of panic that heralded the major terrors. When she got Sally Sawyer, housekeeper at Seth Bishop's, the nearest place to Whatley's, it became her turn to listen instead of transmit. For Sally's boy, Chauncey, who slept poorly, had been up on the hill toward Whatley's, and dashed back in terror after one look at the place, and at the pasturage where Mr. Bishop's cows had been left out all night. "Yes, Miss Corey," came Sally's tremulous voice over the party wire. "Chauncey, he just came back of Boston and couldn't talk for being scared. He said, Whatley's house is all blown up and the timber scattered around and had been dynamite inside. The bottom floor ain't through. It's all covered with this kind of tile-like stuff. Smells awful, just down off the edges of the ground, and the side timber's blown away. And there's awful hinder marks in the yard, too. Great round marks, big around in a hogshead, and all sticky with stuff like it's on a blown-up house. Chauncey says they laid off in the meadows where the great swell right in the barn matted down. Not a stun walls tumbled every which way wherever it goes. And he says, Miss Corey, when he saw it, looked for his cow, frightened as he was, he threw him up in the pasture, and there was hop yard in awful shape. Half of 'em's clean gone, and now half of 'em that's left is sucked dry of most of the blood, with sores on 'em like they'd been on one of these cattle ever since Vinny's blackberry was born.
Southey's gone about night. I had a look at him, but valuing me to very near was birdless. The attention doesn't look careful to show at a better dance world after the pastures, but it says it put toward the glimmer of the village.
I'm not kidding you. This is actually like this dialogue's all written with this inflection. If it's entirely unintelligible, go open the Dunwich Horror on Gutenberg and read along with me. I might actually specifically include the link in the description of the VOD, just because I can't not do this voice, because I can't read this in my, like, nice, even-toned reading voice, because it's written to have this inflection, but, like, it's also, I could clearly tell if it, I could follow why somebody would think this is unintelligible. So maybe open the Dunwich Horror and read with me.
I tell you, Miss Corey, it's not as bright as well to be a brighter fear that old Wilbur Wadley is a kid, but then he deserves it at the bottom of all this. He wasn't our human himself, I would say to everybody. I think Wadley must have raised someone in that little house that wasn't even so human as he was. As I've been out seeing around Dunwich, somebody just give me a dun-diddly notification on the Twitch, and I'm pretty sure it was a host. There always been unseen things around Dunwich. Living things that ain't human ain't good for human folks. The ground was a-talking last night, and 'twas about defensive who the whippoorwills are like, and Corspring Glen he couldn't sleep none. And I thought he heard another faint-like sound over toward Wizard Wadley's, a kind of ripping to tear the wood, like some big bastard crate's been over for a while. I just saw that he didn't get to sleep around. The sun up and over in the woods up this morning. He got over to go to Wadley's to see what's the matter. Well, it's not good enough for Tabor's car. It doesn't mean no good. I think I heard men folks started doing my red party to do something. I saw something was awful about it. I feel that time is now. God knows just what it is. Did you take account of one of them big tracks or the Miss Corey on the Glen? Or this side of the Glen, I didn't get to your house, so Corey must go to Glen South. They do that. I always says Spring Glen ain't healthy in a decent place. Whippoorwills and fireflies and everything act like they're creatures of God. As I said, you couldn't hear strange things rushing and talking in the air down there between the rock tower and the bear den.
By that noon, fully 3/4 of the men and boys of Dunwich were trooping over the roads and meadows between the new-made Watley ruins and Cold Spring Glen, examining in horror the vast, monstrous prince, the maimed Bishop Castle, the strange, noisome wreck of the farmhouse, and the bruised, matted vegetation of the fields and roadsides. Whatever had burst loose upon the world had assuredly gone down into the great sinister ravine, for all the trees on the banks were bent and broken, and a great avenue had been gouged in the precipice hanging underbrush. It was as though a house, launched by an avalanche, had slid down through the tangled growths of the almost vertical slope. From below no sound came, but only a distant, undefinable fetor, and it is not to be wondered at that the men preferred to stay on the edge and argue rather than descend and beard the unknown cyclopean horror in its lair. 3 dogs that were with the party had barked furiously at first, but seemed cowed and reluctant when near the glen. Someone telephoned the news to the Aylesbury Transcript, but the editor, accustomed to wild tales from Dunwich, did no more than concoct a humorous paragraph about it, an item soon afterward reproduced by the Associated Press. That night, when everyone went home, and every house and barn was barricaded as stoutly as possible, needless to say, no cattle were allowed to remain in an open pasturage. About 2 in the morning, a frightful stench and the savage barking of the dogs awakened the household of Downmer Fries on the eastern edge of a Cold Spring Glen, and all agreed that they could hear a sort of muffled swishing or lapping sound from somewhere outside. Miss Fry proposed telephoning the neighbors, and Elmer was about to agree when the noise of splintering wood burst in upon their deliberations. It came apparently from the barn, and was quickly followed by a hideous screaming and stamping among the cattle. The dogs slavered and crouched close to the feet of the fear-numbed family. Fry lit a lantern through force of habit, but knew it would be death to go out into that black farmyard. The children and the womenfolk whimpered, kept from screaming by some obscure vestigial instinct of defense which told them their lives depended on silence. At last the noise of the cattle subsided to a pitiful groaning, and a great snapping, crashing and crackling ensued. And the Frys, huddled together in the sitting-room, did not dare to move until the last echoes died away far down in Cold Spring Glen. Then amidst the dismal moans from the stable and the demoniac piping of the late whippoorwills in the glen, Selenia Fry tottered to the telephone and spread what news she could of the second phase of the horror. The next day all the countryside was in a panic, and cowed, uncommunicative, there we go. And cowed, uncommunicative groups came and went where the fiendish thing had occurred. 2 titan swaths of destruction stretched from the glen to the Fry farmyard. Monstrous prints covered the bare patches of ground, and one side of the old red barn had completely caved in. Of the cattle, only about a quarter could be found and identified. Some of these were in curious fragments, and all that survived had to be shot. Earl Sawyer suggested that help be asked from Aylesbury or Arkham, but others maintained it would be of no use. Old Zebulon Watley, of a branch that hovered about halfway between soundness and decadence, made darkly wild suggestions about rites that ought to be practiced on the hilltops. He came of a line where tradition ran strong, and his memories of chanting in the great stone circles were not altogether connected with Wilbur and his grandfather. Darkness fell upon a stricken countryside, too passive to organize for real defense. In a few cases, closely related families would band together and watch the gloom under one roof. But in general there was only a repetition of the barricading of the night before, and a futile, ineffective gesture of loading muskets and settling pitchforks handily about. Nothing, however, occurred except some hill noises, and when the day had gone, there were so many that hoped the new horror had gone as swiftly as it come. There were even bold souls who proposed an offensive expedition down in the glen, though they didn't venture to set an actual example to the reluctant majority. When night came again, the barricading was repeated, though there was less huddling together of the families. In the morning, both the Fry and Seth Bishop households reported excitement among the dogs and vague sounds and stenches from afar, while early explorers noted with horror a fresh set of the monstrous tracks on the road skirting Sentinel Hill. As before, the sides of the road showed a bruising indicative of the blasphemously stupendous bulk of the horror, while the conformation of the tracks seemed to argue a passage in 2 directions, as if the moving mountain had come from Cold Spring Glen and returned to it along the same path. At the base of the hill, a 30-foot swath of crushed shrubbery and saplings led steeply upward, and the seekers gasped when they saw that even the most perpendicular places did not deflect the inerexible trail. Whatever the horror was, it could scale a sheer stony cliff of almost complete verticality. As the investigators climbed around to the hill's summit by safer routes, they saw that the trail ended, or rather, reversed, there. It was here that the Wattleys used to build their hellish fires and chant their hellish rituals by the table-like stone on May Eve in the Hallowmass. Now that very stone formed the center of a vast space, thrashed around by the mountainous horror, whilst on its slightly concave surface was a thick, fetid deposit of the same tarry stickiness observed on the floor of the ruined Wattley farmhouse when the horror had escaped. Men looked at one another and muttered, then they looked down the hill. Apparently the horror had descended by a route much the same as that of its ascent. To speculate was futile. Reason, logic, and normal ideas of motivation stood confounded. Only did old Zebulon, who wasn't with the group, could have done justice to the situation or suggested a plausible explanation. Thursday night began much like the others, but it ended much less happily. The whippoorwills in the glen had screamed with such unusual persistence that many couldn't sleep, and about 3 a.m. all the party telephones rang. and about 3 a.m. all the party telephones rang tremulously. Those who took down their receivers heard a fright-mad voice shriek out, "Help! Oh my God!" and some thought a crashing sound followed the breaking off of the exclamation. There was nothing more. No one dared do anything, and no one knew till morning from whence the call came. Then those who had heard it called everyone on the line and found that only the Frys didn't reply. The truth appeared an hour later, when a hastily assembled group of armed men trudged out to the Fry place at the head of the glen. It was terrible, but hardly a surprise. There were more swaths and monstrous prints, but there was no longer any house. It had caved in like an eggshell, and amongst the ruins nothing living or dead could be discovered, only a stench and a tarry stickiness. The Elmer Frys had been erased from Dunwich. In the meantime, a quieter, yet even more spiritually poignant phase of the horror had been blackly unwinding itself behind the closed door of a shelf-lined room in Arkham. The curious manuscript record or diary of Wilbur Whately, delivered to Miskatonic University for translation, had caused much worry and bafflement among the experts in languages both ancient and modern. Its very alphabet, notwithstanding a general resemblance to the heavily shaded Arabic used in Mesopotamia, being absolutely unknown to any available authority. The final conclusion of the linguists was that the text represented an artificial alphabet, giving the effect of a cipher. Though none of the usual methods of cryptographic solution seemed to furnish any clue, even when applied on the basis of every tongue the writer might have conceivably used. The ancient books taken from Whately's quarters, while absorbingly interesting and in several cases promising to open up new and terrible lines of research among philosophers and men of science, were of no assistance whatsoever in this matter. One of them, a heavy tome with an iron clasp, was in another unknown alphabet, this one of a very different cast, and resembling Sanskrit more than anything else. The old ledger was at length given wholly into the charge of Dr. Armitage, both because of his peculiar interest in the Whately matter, and because of his wide linguistic learning and skill in the mystical formulae of antiquity and the Middle Ages. Armitage had an idea that the alphabet might be something esoterically used by certain forbidden cults, which have inherited many forms and traditions from the wizards of the Saracenic world. That question, however, he didn't deem vital, since it would be unnecessary to know the origin of the symbols if, as he suspected, they were used as a cipher in a modern language. It was his belief that, considering the great amount of text involved, the writer could scarcely have wished the trouble of using another speech than his own, save perhaps in certain special formulae and incantations. Accordingly, he attacked the manuscript with the preliminary assumption that the bulk of it was in English. Dr. Armitage knew from the repeated failures of his colleagues that the riddle was a deep and complex one, and that no simple mode of solution could merit even a trial. All through late August he fortified himself with vast lore of cryptography, drawing upon the fullest resources of his own library, and waiting night after night against the arcana of Thrimetrius's Polygraphia, Giambaste Postias de furtivis literatum notis, de Vigneris Treatis Chiffres, Falconer's Cryptomenius's Patafacta, Davis and Thickness's 18th century treatises, and such fairly modern authorities as Blair, von Martin, and Kluber's Cryptographic. He interspersed his study of the books with attacks on the manuscript itself, and in time became convinced that he had to deal with one of the most subtlest and ingenious of cryptograms, in which many separate lists of corresponding letters are arranged like the multiplication table, and the message built up with arbitrary keywords known only to the initiated. The older authorities seemed rather more helpful than the newer ones, and Armitage concluded that the code of the manuscript was one of great antiquity, no doubt handed down through a long line of mystical experimenters. Several times he seemed near daylight, only to be set back by some unforeseen obstacle, and then as September approached, the clouds began to clear. Certain letters, as used in certain parts of the manuscript, emerged definitely and unmistakably, and it became obvious that the text was indeed in English. On the evening of September the 2nd, the last major barrier gave way, and Dr. Armitage read for the first time a continuous passage of Wilbur Whately's Annals. It was, in truth, a diary, as all had thought, and it was couched in a style clearly showing the mixed occult erudition and general illiteracy of the strange being who wrote it. Almost the first long passage that Armitage deciphered, an entry dated November 26, 1916, proved highly startling and disquieting. It was written, he remembered, by a child of 3½ who looked like a lad of 12 or 13. Today learned the Aklo for Sabbath. It ran, which it did not like, it being answerable from the hill and not from the air. That upstairs more ahead of me than I had thought it would be, and is not like to have much earth brain. Shot Elam Hutchins's collie Jack when he went to bite me, and Elam says he'd kill me if he does. I guess he won't. Grandfather kept me saying the Dow formula last night, and I think I saw the inner city at the 2 magnetic poles. I shall go to those poles when the earth is cleared off, and if I can't break through it with the Dohna formula when I commit it. They from the air told me at Sabbath that it'll be years before I can clear off the earth, and I guess Grandfather will be dead by then, so I'll have to learn the angles of all the planes and the formulas from between the Ur and the Nyungur. They from the outside will help, but they cannot take body without human blood. That upstairs looks like it'll have the right cast. I can see it a little when I make the Yorish sign or blow the power of Ibn Ghazi at it, and it is near like them at May Eve on the hill. The other face may wear off some. I wonder how I shall look when the earth is cleared and there are no earth beings on it. He that came with the Aklo Sabbath said I may be transfigured, there being much of outside to work on. Morning found the Dr. Armitage in a cold sweat of terror and a frenzy of wakeful concentration. He had not left the manuscript all night, but sat at his table under the electric light, turning page after page with shaking hands as fast as he could decipher the cryptic text. He'd nervously telephoned his wife he would not be home, and when she brought him a breakfast from the house, he could scarcely dispose of a mouthful. All that day he read on, now and then halted maddeningly, as a reapplication of the complex key became necessary. Lunch and dinner were brought to him, but he ate only the smallest fraction of either. Toward the middle of the next night he dozed off in his chair, but soon woke out of a tangle of nightmares almost as hideous as the truths and menaces to man's existence that he had uncovered. On the morning of the September 4th, Professor Rice and Dr. Morgan insisted on seeing him for a while, and he departed trembling and ashen grey. That evening he went to bed, but he slept only fitfully. Wednesday, the next day, he was back at the manuscript, and began to take copious notes both from the current sections and from those he had already deciphered. In the small hours of the night he slept a little in an easy-chair in his office, though he was at the manuscript again before dawn. Some time before noon his physician, Dr. Hartwell, called to see him and insisted that he cease work, and he refused, intimating that if it was of the most vital importance for him to complete the reading of the diary, and promising an explanation in due course of time. That evening, just as twilight fell, he finished his terrible perusal and sank back, exhausted. His wife, bringing his dinner, found him in a half-comatose state, but he was conscious enough to ward her off with a sharp cry when he saw her eyes wander toward the notes he had taken. Weakly rising, he gathered up the scribbled papers and sealed them all in a great envelope, which he immediately placed in his inside coat pocket. He had sufficient strength to get home, but it was so clearly in need of medical aid that Dr. Hartwell was summoned at once. As the doctor put him to bed, he could only mutter over and over again, "But what in God's name could we do?" Armitage slept, but he was partly delirious the next day. He made no explanations to Hartwell, but in his calmer moments spoke of the imperative need of a long conference with Rice and Morgan. His wilder wanderings were very startling indeed, including frantic appeals that something in a boarded-up farmhouse be destroyed, and fantastic references to some plan for the extirpation of the entire human race and all vegetable and animal life from Earth by some terrible elder race of beings from another dimension. He would shout that the world was in danger, since the elder things wished to strip it and drag it away from the solar system and cosmos of matter into some other plane or phase of entity from which it had fallen, vintillions of eons ago. At other times he would call for the dreaded Necronomicon and the Demonolatria of Remigius, in which he seemed hopeful of finding some formula to check the peril he conjured up. "Stop them! Stop them! The Waterleys meant to let them in, and the worst of all is left. Tell Rice and Morgan we must do something. It's a blind business, but I know how to make the powder. It hasn't been fed since the 2nd of August, when Wilbur came here to his death, and at that rate—" But Armitage had a sound physique despite his 73 years, and slept off his disorder that night, without any real fever. He woke late Friday, clear of head and sober, with a gnawing fear and tremendous sense of responsibility. Saturday afternoon, he felt able to go over to the library and summon Rice and Morgan for a conference, and the rest of the day and evening the three men tortured their brains in the wildest speculation and the most desperate debate. Strange and terrible books were drawn voluminously from stacked shelves and from secure places of storage, and diagrams and formulae were copied with feverish haste and in bewildering abundance. Of skepticism there was none. All three had seen the body of Wilbur Wadley as it lay on the floor in a room of that very building, and after that not one of them could feel even slightly inclined to treat the diary as a madman's raving. Opinions were divided as to notifying the Massachusetts State Police, and the negative finally won. There were things involved which simply could not be believed by those who had not seen a sample, as indeed was made clear during certain subsequent investigations. Late at night the conference disbanded without having developed a definite plan, but all day Sunday Armitage was busy comparing formulae and mixing chemicals obtained from the college lab. The more he reflected on the diary, the more he was inclined to doubt the efficacy of any material agent in stamping out the entity which Wilbur Wadley had left behind him, the earth-threatening entity which, unknown to him, was to burst forth in a few hours and become the memorable Dunwich horror. Monday was a repetition of Sunday with Dr. Armitage, for the task in hand had required an infinity of research and experiment. Further consultations of the monstrous diary brought about various changes of plan, and he knew that even in the end a large amount of uncertainty must remain. By Tuesday he had a definite line of action mapped out, and believed he would try a trip to Dunwich within the week. Then on Wednesday the great shock came. Tucked obscurely away in a corner of the Arkham Advertiser was a facetious little item from the Associated Press, telling what a record-breaking monster the bootleg whiskey of Dunwich had raised up. Armitage, half stunned, could only telephone for Rice and Morgan, and far into the night they discussed, and the next day was a whirlwind of preparation on the part of them all. Armitage knew he would be meddling with terrible powers, and yet saw that there was no other way to annul the deeper and more malign meddling which others had done before him. Friday morning, Armitage, Rice, and Morgan set out by motor for Dunwich, arriving at the village about 1 in the afternoon. The day was pleasant, but even in the brightest sunlight a kind of quiet dread and portent seemed to hover about the strangely domed hills and the deep, shadowy ravines of the stricken region. Now and then on some mountain, on top of a gaunt circle of stones, could be glimpsed against the sky. From the air of hushed fright at the Osborne store, they knew something hideous had happened, and soon learned of the annihilation of the Elmer Fry house and family. Throughout that afternoon they rode round Dunwich, questioning the natives concerning all that had occurred, and seeing for themselves with rising pangs of horror the drear Fry ruins with their lingering traces of the tarry stickiness, the blasphemous tracks in the Fry yard, the wounded Seth Bishop cattle, and the enormous swaths of disturbed vegetation in various places. The trail up and down Sentinel Hill seemed to Armitage of almost cataclysmic significance, and he looked long at the sinister altar-like stone on the summit. At length the visitors, apprised of a party of state police which had come from Aylesbury that morning in response to the first telephone reports out of the Fry tragedy, decided to seek out the officers and compare notes as far as practicable. This, however, they found more easily planned than performed, since no sign of the party could be found in any direction. There had been 5 of them in a car, but now the car stood empty near the ruins in the Fry yard. The natives, all of whom had talked with the policeman, seemed at first as perplexed as Armitage and his companions, and then old Sam Hutchins thought of something, and turned pale, nudging Fred Farr and pointing to the dank, deep hollow that yawned close by.
God. I told him not to go down to the glen, and never had had anybody do it with them tracks and the smell and the wheels and screeching down there dark in the middle of noon.
A cold shudder ran through the natives and the visitors alike, and every ear seemed strained in an instinctive, unconscious listening. Armitage, now that he'd actually come upon the horror and its monstrous work, trembled with the responsibility he felt to be his. Night would soon fall, and then the mountains of blasphemy would lumber upon its outer course. Negutium perambulans in tenebris. The old librarian rehearsed the formulae he'd memorized, and clutched the paper containing the alternative ones he hadn't. He saw that his electric flashlight was in working order. Rice beside him took from a valise a metal sprayer of the sort used in combating insects, whilst Morgan uncased the big game rifle on which he relied, despite his colleague's warnings that no material weapon would be of help. Armitage, having read the hideous diary, knew painfully well what sort of a manifestation to expect, but he didn't add to the fright of the Dunwich people by giving any hints or clues. He hoped that it might be conquered without any revelation of the world or the monstrous thing it had escaped. And as the shadows gathered, the natives commenced to disperse homeward, anxious to bar themselves indoors, despite the present evidence that all human locks and bolts were useless before a force that could bend trees and crush houses when it chose. They shook their heads at the visitors' plan to stand guard at the Fry ruins near the glen, and as they left had little expectancy of seeing the watchers ever again. There were rumblings under the hill that night, and the whippoorwills piped threateningly. Once in a while a wind, sweeping up out of Cold Spring Glen, would bring such a touch of ineffable fetor to the heavy night air, such a fetor as all three of the watchers had smelled once before, when they stood above a dying thing that had passed for 15 years and a half as a human being. But the looked-for terror did not appear. Whatever was down there in the glen was biding its time, and Armitage told its colleagues that it would be suicidal to try and attack it in the dark. Morning came wanly, and the night sounds ceased. It was a grey, bleak day, and now and then a drizzle of rain, and heavier clouds seemed to be piling themselves up beyond the hills to the northwest. The men from Arkham were undecided what to do. Seeking shelter from the increasing rainfall beneath one of the few undestroyed Fry outbuildings, they debated the wisdom of waiting, or of taking the aggressive and going down into the glen in quest of their nameless, monstrous quarry. The downpour waxed in heaviness, and distant peals of thunder sounded from far horizons. Sheet lightning shimmered, and then a forky bolt flashed near at hand, as if descending into the accursed glen itself. The sky grew very dark, and the watchers hoped the storm would prove a short, sharp one, followed by clear weather. It was still gruesomely dark when, not much over an hour later, a confused babble of voices sounded down the road. Another moment brought to view a frightened group of more than a dozen men, running, shouting, and even whimpering hysterically. One in the lead began sobbing out words, and the Arkham men started violently when the words developed a coherent form.
It's gone again. It's everybody. It's out of moving environment, and I don't know Lord knows when to be outside.
And the speaker panted into silence, but another took up his message.
Down an hour ago, Zeb Whiteley here had the frontal ringers, and Miss Carr, Miss George's wife, lives down about the junction. Says the high bar that was out driving the cars for time after that big rolling when sees all the trees have been in the mighty glen. Opposite side of this, and he smelled that same awful smell like he smelled when found the tracks of Monday morning. And says he was just swishing and lapping around. Not more than bending trees, the bushes come in, and all of a sudden the trees along the road get pushed one side, and it was off on the starboard display in the mud. Man, you lose, I didn't see nothing at all. They just bending the trees in the underbrush. At far ahead, the Bristol truck goes under the road, and you hear off a creek and straight on the bridge. You can hit the side of the wood side and the crack split. And all the wires never see the ring on the trees, the bushes abandoned. When the swishing sang of a fire up on the road toward the Whiteley's, the sound of the hill, and it was the Whiteley, you know. And the lizard had the guts to step up when he heard the first look at the ground. It was all mud and water. The sky was dark and the rain was wrapping the tracks about as fast as could be. There's again the glen mile where the trees are moved. Still some of them big awful prints of barrels are seen all Monday.
And at this point, the first speaker interrupted.
That ain't the trouble now. There's the star. There was kind of folks, everybody, and they're listening with Santa Claus. Best have Bishop Craven and Keeper says carrying out fit to kill. Says the trees are bending on the side of the road. There's a kind of mushy sound, elephants puffing and trading. They're heading for the house. There's a spoke of sudden and a fearful smell. It says like about chance he was screaming, just like it was spelled wildly when it was Monday morning. And the dog's barking and whining something awful. And that terrible yell, it says the shut down the road just caved in, the storm blowed it over, the wind wasn't strong enough to do that. They were listening, there were lots of folk on the wire gasping. Once the sides yet again, in front of yard picket fence crumbled up, no sign of what done it. And everybody on the line could hear Chancey and the old bishop yelling. See how they were shrieking about nothing heavy to truck the house, and one night there was something heavy against the front. Kept blasting again and again. Couldn't see nothing of the front windows. And then
lines of fright deepened on every face, and Armitage, shaken as he was, had barely poise enough to prompt the speaker.
Sadly, the castle's caving in, and why? We hear a terrible crash and a whole flock of screaming. So that was fire. I'm afraid, please. Took our lives.
The man paused, and another of the crowd spoke.
That's not all. That's Sanders Creek over the front of that. Who's you still like? We'd heard about the part in the wagon that rounded up as many able-bodied men of the Oak Guild. They had a car's place and come up to see what the boss had the best to do. That's what I was thinking the Lord judged me for an act with this, but there's no more again. I was set aside.
Armitage saw that the time for positive action had come and spoke decisively to the faltering group of frightened rustic. We must follow it, boys. I believe there's a chance of putting it out of business. You men know that those Waddleys were wizards. Well, this thing is a kind of wizardry and must be put down by the same means. I've seen Wilbur Waddley's diary and read some of the strange old books he used to read, and I think I know the right kind of a spell to recite and make the thing fade away. One can't be sure, but of course we can always take a chance. It's invisible. I knew it would be, but there's a powder in this long-distance sprayer that might make it show up for just a second. Later on we'll try it. It's a frightful thing to have alive, but it isn't as bad as what Wilbur would have let in if he'd lived longer. You'll never know what the world has escaped. Now we've only one thing to fight, and it can't multiply. It can do, though, a lot of harm, so we mustn't hesitate to rid the community of it. We must follow it, and the way to begin is to go to the place that had just been wrecked. Let somebody lead the way. I don't know your roads very well, but I've an idea that there might be a shorter cut across lots. How about it? The men shuffled about a moment, and then Earl Sawyer spoke softly, pointing with a grimy finger through the steadily lessening rain.
I guess you could get to Sir Bishop quicker by cutting across the Lord Meadow here, wading the brook at the low place, climbing the carriers mowing and the timber lot beyond. It comes down the upper road and mighty nice there, so a little other side.
And Armitage, with Rice and Morgan, started to walk in the direction indicated, and most of the natives followed slowly. The sky was growing lighter, and there were signs that the storm had finally worn itself out. When Armitage inadvertently took a wrong direction, Osborne warned him and walked ahead to show the right one. Courage and confidence were mounting, though the twilight of almost perpendicular wooded hill, whose lay toward the end of their shortcut, and among whose fantastic ancient trees they had to scramble up as if a ladder, put these qualities to a severe test. At length they finally emerged on a muddy road to find the sun coming out. They were a little beyond the Seth Bishop place, but bent trees and hideously unmistakable tracks showed what had passed by. Only a few moments were consumed in surveying the ruins just around the bend. It was the Fry incident all over again, and nothing dead nor living was found in either of the collapsed shells which had been the Bishop house and barn. Nobody cared to remain there amidst the stench and terror sickness, but all turned instinctively to the line of horrible prints leading on toward the wrecked Wadley farmhouse and the altar-crowned slopes of Sentinel Hill. As the men passed the side of Wilbur Wadley's abode, they shuddered visibly and seemed again to mix hesitancy with their zeal. It was no joke tracking down something as big as a house that one couldn't see, but that all the vicious malevolence of a demon. Opposite the base of Sentinel Hill, the tracks left the road, and there was a fresh bending and matting visible along the broad swath marking the monster's former route to and from the summit. Armitage produced a pocket telescope of considerable power and scanned the steep green side of the hill. And then he handed the instrument to Morgan, whose sight was keener. And after a moment of gazing, Morgan cried out sharply, passing the glass to Earl Sawyer and indicating a certain spot on the slope with his finger. Sawyer, as clumsy as most non-users of optical devices are, fumbled a while, but eventually focused the lenses with Armitage's aid. And when he did so, his cry was less restrained than Morgan's had been.
Somebody, there ain't some bushes are moving, so going up and slow like creeping up to the top of this minute. Heaven only knows what for.
And then the germ of panic seemed to spread among the seekers. It was one thing to chase the nameless entity, but quite another to find it. Spells might be all right, but suppose they weren't? Voices began questioning Armitage about what he knew of the thing, and no reply seemed quite to satisfy. Everyone seemed to feel himself in close proximity to phases of nature and of being utterly forbidden and wholly outside the sane experience of mankind. Alright, folks, since I got a bit of a late start, that's all we have time for this evening. We'll come back next week with Chapter 10. Things are really heating up here, and hopefully we'll finish up this book next week. In the meantime, I need to announce what one Frozen Tundra finds. It won't be much use to y'all listening to this as the VOD, because there will be a separate video going up on Monday for you all, that will have already gone up for the VOD folks on Monday, but I need to announce it to the stream. So, what one Frozen Tundra finds is The Legend of Zelda. That's right, the classic Legend of Zelda won Frozen Tundra finds with 5 votes out of 9. The other 4 were spread evenly among other games. The second place, or the second most, you know how we chose your first choice, your second choice, and your third choice? The winner of the second choice was, oddly enough, Dungeons & Dragons Eye of the Beholder, which makes me really glad there was not a tie for first place, because that would have meant I had to play that, and that game was bad. And there was a much better spread on the everybody's second choice. And then the third choice, it was actually pretty evenly split between quite a few games. There was not a very clear leader. But also, I've gotten in contact with the winner of the Alexa contest. There was only one person who actually entered, and they got all 15 entries, every thumbnail, every hidden thing in the thumbnail they saw, they found, and I'm impressed, and I'll be mailing that off to the contest winner as soon as possible. But anyway, guys, the Legend of Zelda episodes will start in April, because it's Childhood Games Month in March, and I have some other things planned, but we'll cross that bridge when we get there. For now, this has been Paper Cuts, and I hope it didn't sting.